Cal State Northridge is paying tribute to comic book creator Jack Kirby with an art gallery full of his works. Jack Kirby created The Avengers, X-Men, and Captain America, all of which have been turned into movies. The exhibit focuses on the latter half of Kirby's 50-year career when he wrote about superheroes such as the Eternals and the mighty Thor. It is one of the largest Kirby exhibits ever and the first to be held at a university. Visitors might feel like they're walking into a comic book panel. They can also scroll through high-resolution cover art and other sketches on iPads. And visitors can take home a full color catalog. On Point's Teresa Barrientos has more on the story.
Thank you, James. Joining me today is Mr. Scott Fresina, a comic art instructor, Mr. Carr owner of Earth 2 Comics in Sherman Oaks, and Professor Charles Hatfield, who is the Jack Kirby exhibition curator here at CSUN. Welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
So I'd like to start off by asking, what was your first experience with a Jack Kirby comic?
My first experience, I went to a friend's house. My parents would bring me over. He's got a boy, they have a boy your age, that sort of thing. He would show me his comics, and I remember, in fact, he had a lot of comic books, and so he gave me a lot of them. He gave me the DC comics and the Harvey comics. He says, "You can't have any of my Marvels, though," and he pulled those aside. Immediately, I wanted to know what these things were, that they were special. But the thing that hit me right away was that these didn't look anything like the other comics. I figured out just a few months later that that was because of the art of Jack Kirby. Everything was just bursting off the page. It was like nothing else I'd ever seen before. So that was my first exposure to Jack Kirby comics. It must have been 1964. It's a long time ago.
Okay. Professor, how about you?
I don't remember, because I don't remember a time when I wasn't reading Kirby comics. I have kind of a memory of where I sort of locked in and started spending what little allowance money I had to buy every new Kirby comic I could get. And that was about 1975. I was about 10 years old. And I used to say, well, that was how I started. But actually, I go back and I think, no. I saw all these comic books that I know were drawn by Jack Kirby before that. So I was very familiar with the Fantastic Four even before that. Or there's a page in the exhibition from a comic that I now vividly remember reading in my grandmother's living room. I was in front of her TV set.
Which book is that?
The Demon, number 14.
Oh, yeah.
And there's this page that shows the demon flying through the air, and it says deadly doppelganger. That's where I learned the word doppelganger. I learned that word from that comic at that moment in my grandmother's living room. And so as time goes on, I realize I have more and more Jack Kirby memories that aren't really clear, right? But as far as fixating on him, I really started to fixate on him in fairly late in his career. I was 10 and he was in his 50s. My favorite was Commandy, the Last Boy on Earth, which is about a world that's completely different, where the animals rule and the humans are bestial and enslaved, and it was very much a Planet of the Apes kind of world. But I love that kid, Commandy, the kid in that comic, and I love that book because every month it was some new thing. It's talking dolphins this time. It's the gorillas versus the tigers next month. It's this, it's that. And you just couldn't keep up with Kirby. He was always 2 steps ahead of anybody.
It's interesting that Charles mentions Commandy, because that's probably the first Jack Kirby series that I read regularly. But the interesting thing for me is I started out as a kid reading like the funny comics, Dennis the Menace and Richie Rich and things like that. But one day I had a friend who said, let's get some superhero comics. And we walked up to the newsstand, and I picked up a Superboy because it was kind of safe. And he picked up this reprint of a Jack Kirby Fantastic Four comic. It was probably one of the later Marvel's greatest comics, but one of the, and it was a big picture of like Galactus and the Fantastic Four out in space, and I remember being scared. I was like, I could not pick up that comic. I went sort of for the safe, cute Superboy off at camp with some, some campers kind of thing, and it wasn't really until years later that I kind of found my way back to, oh, this is where all this, crazy, mind-boggling Marvel comic stuff began, because it just took me a few years to get back there. But
I'm glad you said that, because Superboy versus what they were doing over at Marvel, what Jack and Stan were doing, I was so used to the conventions of DC Comics, being that was the U.S. Steel of superheroes, right? That I'm sitting there, looking at characters like the Hulk, and I thought, who does this character that looks like a super Frankenstein? Where's his secret lair? Where's his Hulkmobile? Where's his, all these conventions that DC Comics, they used to rubber stamp their heroes with, Marvel didn't have, and I was just in new territory here, so.
Yeah, and I was looking at a 1971 Superboy comic versus a reprint of a 1968 Marvel comic, and the Marvel comic was still years ahead of the Superboy comic.
So, Professor, why was Jack Kirby chosen as the main focus of this exhibition?
Because I was crazy. No, what it is that I met the gallery director, Jim Sweeters. He's been a long-time gallery director here at CSUN. He runs the CSUN Art Galleries, and I met him about 5 years ago. I went to a show at the gallery, and I hadn't been to the gallery much. I mean, I'd really been ignoring it. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing we have on campus. It's a great resource, and I, like a lot of people, I commuted back and forth to school, and I didn't really think about that. And so there was this show. It was back in, I think, March of 2010, and I was working on a book about Jack Kirby at that time. I was finishing up this book called Hand of Fire, which I spent a handful of years writing. And there was this show of Robert Williams, who's a well-known painter and cartoonist and all-around artist, great show. And that got me, because it had a comics connection, it got me to come in and really check out the gallery, and they had done something spectacular. And I met the gallery director that night. Robert Williams came and gave a talk, he signed some books, and I happened to find myself talking to the man who, as it turned out, was the gallery director. And almost immediately he said to me, we had never met. He said, we could do a comic show. What do you think about a comic show? We were sort of vaguely kicking around this idea. And then I happened to see him again a few days later at another event by coincidence off campus. And again, we said hello. And so these conversations started about 5 years ago. And then when my book on Kirby, which was sort of a lifetime of thinking about Kirby, actually did come out at the end of 2011, it was at that point that we stopped talking vaguely about a comic show. We had all these ideas for different themes: Los Angeles artists, fantasy artists, young artists, different artists. All that talk went by the wayside once my Kirby book came out and got a pretty good reception. I said, Jim, I want to do a Kirby show, which is it's a big thing to do. I didn't realize how big. He's a very sought-after artist. And Jim said, yeah, sure. And Jim, the gallery director, sort of introduced me to the gallery world and got me to think about how to make a good show. And I introduced him to the Kirby art. My mind was still sort of revving with all the Jack. I mean, I've been reading Kirby almost all of my life, but I was really steeped in it after my book. And so Jim said yes, and then we started wooing the collectors, which, there's a bunch of long stories there, but it's actually a big thing for us to have taken on at CSUN, to have done our very first show of original comic book art being Jack Kirby. It's like starting at the top.
Yeah.
It's basically starting at the top, but it worked.
Like Professor Charles could tell you, Jack Kirby, I mean, of all artists, Jack Kirby was amazingly prolific. I mean, you could fill this studio with pages of his artwork and still have enough for more. So what we have there in the gallery is some really great stuff there. But really, it's the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg. The man was incredibly prolific. So not only is the stuff groundbreaking and wonderful, he kept cranking this out. He was really...
He always worked at full speed.
Yes.
And we know he did somewhere north of 20,000 pages of books in his life, of which we have, 100 pages on our gallery wall.
Now, his top speed in his prime was supposed to be 8 pages a day. And I used to watch him draw, and the really interesting thing is other guys that I'd worked for, Howard Chaykin and Frank Miller, all these guys sketch, and it's the way I teach sketching too. You pretty much have an idea of this is the frame, and what are you going to put here, and so you sketch it, and then you start filling it in, and he didn't do that. Jack would start at the middle or the corner, and he would draw the whole thing out like with one line, as if he was just tracing it. It was already there. And I used to ask the late Dave Stevens, who was also a friend of mine, how does he do this? And he said, really, he's been doing this since he was 5 years old. You do it since you're 5 years old. You look at the page and you know what's supposed to be there. You almost have a muscle memory.
Well, it's like Outliers. I mean, the idea that, he's been, 10,000 hours or whatever
Yeah.
the number is.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'd like to ask, where did all the pieces of the exhibition collection come from?
They came from about 16 or 17 collectors, some in California and some farther away. Some of the collectors loaned comic books to the show, as indeed Carr did. He loaned comic books to the show from his collection. Most of the collectors actually owned art, and the art, in most cases, I'll say in 100 out of 107 cases, right, the art is actually production art that went into making comic books.
There's a few that aren't, but most of them are. Yeah.
Yeah, so again, you know, we got comic books, the published things from some folks, because we wanted people to see what this was like. You know, this is what it looked like when it hit the drugstore or the newsstand or the supermarket. This is what it's like when people bought it way back when. And then we have all that production art, which is mostly on the walls and surrounding everything else. And again, there's like 16 or 17 lenders of that stuff. Some people loaned one thing or two things, and some people loaned dozens of things. So the ask was different for every person.
Wasn't there one entire story from Commandy? That was all from one collection.
The whole issue of Commandy, which is Commandy number 14, so circa 1973. There's a whole issue of Thor. Thor number 155 is about 5 years earlier, so that gives us a comic published by DC in the 70s and a comic published by Marvel in the 60s. And these things were produced in very different ways, and part of what we wanted to do was to help the public see the production process. So if you go and look at the original art, some things you'll see are like signs of distress and damage and the sort of process they went through, which was not delicate, you know. I mean, production art gets treated roughly. And we wanted people to see that as well. So yeah, we were lucky enough to have two complete stories in the show, so that if people really wanted to, if they could stand there long enough without their feet hurting, right, they could absorb a whole story or parts of a story. And some people have told me they've read that whole story standing in, and even people who know nothing about that comic, and come away sort of being shocked, impressed, moved, or bewildered by it, which is exactly what we wanted. Not only that it looks cool, but that there's a story with a bit of to it, and which is, you know, why
The
that
nice thing too is that you have pieces that are inked and then pieces that are Jack's pencils. And the thing I like about seeing Jack's pencils is that unlike a lot of artists who would just, you know, if you have to spot the blacks or a shadow, they just put an X there, indicating to the inker, just make this solid black. Jack didn't do that. He would, it's like he didn't trust other guys to, you know. And the thing is that he does the strokes in this way that it sort of explodes out. If you look at the, you know, it's one thing that you don't get with the comics and the production art, you know, that is inked. You go back to the pencils and you see, like, you know how they do those Kirby rocks, you know, and the rocks have this boom. Now, it's not so it's realistic, but it really feels like, I mean, because some of the shadows where they're sitting, it's an actual cheek, you know. But, I mean, Jack is doing something beyond realism. It's kind of surreal here, but it really crackles with power. It pulses with power.
Yeah,
That's why I'm glad you have pencils as well.
Realism be damned. We're lucky to have a few pencil pieces. I mean, Kirby's thing is that he's a story generator. He can do the art from beginning to end very well. He's very, very capable. So he can ink it, he can finish it, but he usually doesn't, either because out of his own choice or because of the people he's working for. They want him to generate more stories. So most of the things you'll see in the exhibition are inked by other hands. That is to say, the inking and the lettering will be finished, right? Mike Royer or Vince Coletta or Frank Giacoya or Joe Sinnott. These are all names that comic book collectors think about. And we built a part of the exhibition where you could compare the kind of before and after, where you could see a photocopy of the page before it was inked, and then see what was done afterwards. And in fact, Tom Kraft, who's one of our lenders for the show, and he's one of the trustees of the Jack Kirby Museum, designed this brilliant iPad display where you can swipe your fingers back and forth and actually go from the pencils, which only survive as ancient photocopies, right? And then the actual inks. And in this way, you can evaluate or begin to infer for yourself, you know, which of these artists was very faithful to what Jack was putting down, and which ones took liberties, and which ones took liberties successfully, and which ones took liberties, you know, maybe less successfully.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, there's like 3 or 4 pieces. I think there are 3 pieces in the show that are actually inked by Kirby.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They have a certain look to them. They have a kind of look to them. It tells me they're inked by Kirby.
Yeah.
But to have any of those is very rare because mostly, I mean, you know, the show has to be a tribute to these other artists, not only to Jack Kirby, because as a story generator, he's either too busy or too impatient to ink the page. He needs someone else reliable to finish that process.
Yeah, he always told me he didn't like inking, that when he was finished penciling the story, he's on to the next. He didn't even like going back doing the covers.
But he was good at all those things. He just didn't like doing them.
Yeah.
And so did Jack Kirby do anything other than superheroes?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mentioned to you before, he and Joe Simon in the 40s had basically created romance comics because romance was big on the radio. You know, you got to remember, comics back then were a cheap mass market form of entertainment, and they were just going with the heat. They said, hey, maybe this will sell. I mean, because comics mostly sold to young boys, and so they were looking to repeat that success with girls. The romance comics, so basically romance comics are created by Jack Kirby and Joe Simon. The very genre is created by them. It's not what he's famous for. And it's not even the comics that girls ended up picking up. We were saying before, the Archie comics is probably the most popular. It's still probably the most popular.
But you know, they sold really well. And one of the things that I discovered or rediscovered while I was working on the exhibition is that these romance comics that started in '47, I mean, that genre is almost invisible in comic book stores today, right?
Yeah.
Or at least, you know, I mean, apart maybe from
Unless it's done as sort of like a campy homage kind of thing.
or in manga, perhaps, if it's reported in Japanese work, we see a lot of those stories about relationships. But there's an interesting stat. Jack Kirby drew more pages of romance between about 1947 and 57 than he did of any other genre, of all the other genres he worked in combined. And during that time, he was doing westerns, crime comics, horror comics, science fiction comics, superhero comics. He drew more pages of romance, and he was able to buy a house in the suburbs with romance money. I mean, that's kind of how he moved out of Brooklyn, and he moved into the suburbs in Long Island, as did his partner Joe Simon, who bought a house right next door. And they were, for a while there, they were flush with money because romance books were 1/4 of the entire market. And we're talking about a market that's exponentially bigger than today. I mean, a market where they moved like 1 billion comic books in a year. Gigantic, around 1949, 1950.
They were all a dime back then, so that's a lot of dimes.
And so there were a lot of people who read those romance books. And of course, you know, Kirby had the westerns, and he had the horror books, and he had, you know, they would try their hand. He and his partners would try their hand at whatever.
Career of Kirby is basically the history of comics. I mean, it really is. And it's interesting, Professor, what you're saying about the stats. I was reading somewhere, and this surprised me too, that Jack Kirby did more work actually for DC than he did for Marvel. I mean, only by maybe 3% or something.
It's not what he's known for.
But it's not what he's known for,
right? I mean, in the shops, right? It's Kirby and it's the Marvel aesthetic, right? Is that
largely? Yeah. I mean, in leading up to those Marvel, the Marvel superhero comics, a lot of the ideas that led to those Marvel comics began in the one-off monster titles, with Stan Lee and Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby doing these 5-page, you know, twist-ending monster stories that began a lot of like the big ideas that you would later see come through in the superhero comics. So it seems everything was kind of building toward that Marvel era that has come to dominate.
And how are all of the comic books doing nowadays, since everyone's going to watch the movies?
That's a retailer question.
That's a great question,
man.
The great thing is, as big as Marvel was in comics, until this era of movies started with Iron Man and Avengers, not everybody, the man on the street, knew who, you know, Spider-Man was Peter Parker or Iron Man was Tony Stark. Those were names that were not as familiar as Batman, Superman, Clark Kent, etc. So the movies have brought those characters to new people. But it's not always comics that they buy. Sometimes it's they want the water bottle or the magnets or the action figures. They like the stuff and they love the characters. It doesn't necessarily always lead them into the comics. But on the other side, if it leads them into comics, sometimes it takes them into comics that aren't necessarily the superhero ones, because that kind of, you know, pop culture comic book sensibility is everywhere.
An interesting thing that Carr touched on here was that certainly, you know, everybody knew who Superman, Batman was. You know, my dad, who knows who they are, and he didn't even read comics. But when, like the X-Men movie, even before the Iron Man, when the X-Men movie did surprisingly well, suddenly, you know, there's a market for these old comic books that are worth a lot of money. First Wolverine goes from like $500 for first appearance to $1,000. I mean, doubled, you know. Those kind of numbers happened for Iron Man. Strangely enough, did not happen for the Spider-Man one because he's Marvel's most famous character. He's the closest thing they have to a Batman or Superman.
Right.
So that didn't do that kind of a quantum leap.
One thing that I've seen now, and maybe you can speak to this too, as somebody whose business is in the shops, is that, I mean, to me, it's not only about superheroes; it's about comics. I mean, I'm just sort of helplessly in love with any.
One's a genre, one's a medium.
Right. And I used to say, and I've said a lot, I've said it in class, I've said it outside of class, that the livelihood of the medium, the livelihood of the art form was going to depend on getting beyond superheroes, kind of getting over that speed bump, which so dominates the fandom, but to me doesn't really dominate the art form. And I would say that, and I still sort of stand by that, but one thing I've noticed is that I was wrong about something. I was wrong about the idea that as long as it was superheroes, the rest of the world wouldn't pay attention. And one thing you see a lot with superheroes, and my students talk about it a lot, is that these are stories of identity. And many of the great and famous stories in comics, whether they're superhero stories or autobiographical stories, or stories of identity, and they're often stories of divided identity, and that speaks to a lot of people. So it speaks to, it seems increasingly that the Marvel phenomenon speaks to readers of color. It speaks to women as well as men in a much greater way than we would have, that a comic book fan might have expected 20 years ago. So, you know, when you see characters like Marvel's first Islamic headline hero, Ms. Marvel, Kamala Khan, who's a teenage Pakistani American, you know, a Muslim superhero, a really popular trend-setting comic, building on Jack Kirby concepts, among other things. I mean, you know, those comics are often filled with Kirby characters as well as others, but it's this story about having a divided life and being between, I mean, who cannot identify with that? And so I was mistaken, I think, in underselling the potential of these things to really reach out to readers who hadn't been, you know, in the nerd clubhouse like me all of their lives, right? Because I've been in that treehouse with, you know, all that time, but it has expanded, I think, a lot. I don't know if you see that, but I see that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so, speaking of readers, is there a large audience of women in the comic book world?
More than there were before, I find.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's probably one of the fastest growing segments. You know, if you look at it as a market segment or as an audience, and partially it's because it isn't just the the male power fantasies anymore. I mean, there's a lot of other companies like Image Comics, and even Marvel with Ms. Marvel, and even DC with things they've done with Batgirl and other characters, where they are working to go, oh, it's not just, you know, let's not just do the male power fantasies. Let's try and find other types of stories to tell.
Are there any women comic book creators?
Oh yeah,
tons.
Amanda Connor's a terrific artist.
Yeah, Gail Simone, you know.
Fiona Staples, Kelly Sue DeConnick, the list goes on and on. G. Willow Wilson, who writes Ms. Marvel. Recently, Forbes magazine did a piece, Forbes Online did a piece, just a few weeks ago. It's written by Rob Salkowitz. He's a scholar. He wrote a book on Comic-Con and the business of pop culture, and now he writes for Forbes. And he did this piece where, through a rather large survey, you know, of thousands of people, he was able to provide some data. Maybe not about comic book readership, but about people who attend comic book conventions. That's almost like a 50-50 parity of women and men. In fact, the women who attend comic book conventions are the growing part of the demographic. Yes. So now, again, they may not be coming to the shops to buy comics or comics only, or they may. I mean, I have many students who are serious fans of monthly comics, women as well as men in my classes. But we know that when you go to Comic-Con, when you go to WonderCon, when you go to the new cons that are springing up all over the place, the regional cons, Denver, Portland, Seattle, New York, there's a huge representation of women in that.
Mm-hmm. If you look at those videos on YouTube, and certainly you must have seen some of these, girls really get into this cosplay thing. This is not what I grew up with at all. I mean, I grew up with it was just a boys' club, like a bunch of dorks in a treehouse. Now I got these women wearing Vampirella costumes. I mean, like hot stuff. You know what I'm saying? If I was a young man now going to there, boy, I would be forget about it. You know, but it is the greatest growing thing now, and it's the whole face of it has changed. You know, and yeah, like you say, I'm looking and. Maybe it's just me, but I notice there's all these girls wearing these costumes, and I think to myself,
But it's not yeah.
I really enjoy this, you know, and I keep thinking about what, you know, so they must be reading the comics or seeing the cartoons or something, and, you know.
Many have
Comic
a lot
books
of
are, at its core, it's serial fiction. You know, when people come in looking for Spider-Man, I always say it's, it's a 60-year running soap opera.
Yeah.
It's, who's Spider-Man with. So all these stories have that serial nature. I mean, obviously it appeals to both genders, but there's always been a strong, female aspect to that. What's going to happen next? What's going to happen next in the story? What are the characters going to do? It's something to read. I mean, we have days in the shop where the female customers outnumber the men.
Okay, so for my next question, I'm sure you've all thought about this a great deal. Which of Kirby's characters would you want to be rescued by in a crisis?
There's a question of who would be most fun to be rescued by, and there's a question of who would be the most dependable.
Yeah.
And there's a question of one that you would most enjoy meeting. I'm not sure the most dependable one would be the most enjoyable one.
Yeah, right.
Lockjaw. Lockjaw is a giant bulldog the size of a VW bus
teleports.
with a tuning fork in his forehead, which is always surrounded by fizzing, crackling energy, because Jack Kirby loved fizzing, crackling energies more than anybody. And Lockjaw is a dog that teleports. Right? Now, they have the Inhumans now on the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. series, but the one Inhuman they ain't got that they desperately need, they need Lockjaw.
Yeah.
This dog.
This
He's like Crystal's pet dog, and he appears and whisks you away from danger. He's in Ms. Marvel now, I think. He follows that character around almost like he's become a pet. So, I mean, if you wanted to get into and out of a scrape, you need someone who can blink into one place and out of another. And I like dogs.
See, that's interesting.
Lockjaw.
He said that because I was thinking about teleportation also. It wasn't a Marvel character, but any of the DC New Gods would open a boom tube.
Right.
So if I was in a jam, I'd jump through it and I'd be in another dimension
Boom
somewhere.
tube's kind of like a cosmic siphon that goes, big tunnel that appears
Jump through it and
suddenly.
you're hyperspace away. Oh, yeah.
See, I think the most reliable guy would be that I'd want to be saved by is Benjamin J. Grimm, the ever-loving blue-eyed thing. He's the original member of the Fantastic Four, exposed to cosmic radiation, and is now an orange, lumpy monster. And again, it's sort of
a walking box of rocks.
He's a walking box of rocks.
With a heart as big as all out.
Exactly. You can rely on Ben Grimm.
Right.
And there's like a tragedy, but also just a great
Yeah,
personality.
that is a great character. I mean,
Yes, it
Lockjaw's
is.
a fun character, but Ben Grimm is a character with real dimension and trouble. That makes
Reading
him,
comics as a kid, Ben Grimm, the Thing, is one of the characters that when you read the comic, I heard, because of how Kirby drew him, I heard the voice in my head.
Yeah.
Because he talked like this. He was from Brooklyn, and he talked like this, and it was, hey, it's clobbering time.
You're gonna make me cry in my beer.
And he had all the funny lines. Are you the Thing? No, I'm Simon and Garfunkel with the cigar, which is very much Jack Kirby because
See
he
what
was a
happens
cigar
when you ask a
smoker
simple
for
question?
years.
Things go off the rails.
Well, thank you so much, everyone,
Thank
for
you.
joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A single ember that escapes from a wildfire can travel more than a mile. You can't control where that ember will land, only what happens when it does. Get Fire Adapted now at fireadapted.org.
Thank you for watching. For all of us here at On Point, I'm James Lindsey, and we'll see you next week.